And in the development topic, you need to know the following key stages. So the first one is the 4 stages of development. So you need to know that the prenatal stage is 9 months in utero, which basically just means before the baby's born. So the 9 months that it's growing. So this is development in the womb before birth. Childhood is 0 to 12 years old, and this is where a lot of development happens. And children are reliant on parents to teach them things like walking and talking. Then we've got adolescence, which is 13 to 19-year-old, which is the transitional stage from childhood to adulthood. So when puberty occurs, lots of changes happen into the body and to the brain. And then adulthood is 20 to death. So this is the full development, although the body is still passing through changes and you take on new responsibilities, you have intimate relationships, parenthood, and careers and things like that. So oftentimes it's a match up or a gap fill or something like that to do with these. You also need to know what happens in these stages of development. So you might be asked to pick a stage and then say what is happening to the brain in those stages. So for prenatal before birth, in the first trimester, you've got a neural tube, and this becomes the brain and the spinal cord. And then you have lots of cells that migrate and become neurons and the nervous system. And at about 2 months, that neural tube divides into the brain and creates all the different lobes of the brain, like the frontal lobe, the temporal lobe, parietal, occipital. And then around 4 to 6 months, we've got 100 billion neurons. And at about 5 months, you've got some synapse developing. Now, you don't need to know absolutely everything here, but you need enough for about a 3 or a 4 marker. So you kind of need a few facts there to put in. A little bit of information about how a neuron passes a signal, although it's very unlikely that you'd need kind of a lot of this information. So we've got an electrical signal coming into a dendrite, travels to the nucleus of the cell, which is where it kind of sends signals, decides to send them or not. It goes down the axon to the end, which is the axon terminal, and then the electrical signal turns into a chemical signal across the synapse. The synapse is a gap between the two neurons, and the neurons they pass messages to each other. And the neurotransmitters are like little kind of, if you think of like in blood, you've got hormones. In the brain, you've got neurotransmitters like chemicals. So things like serotonin and dopamine, they pass between the synapse and they bind to the receptors on the postsynaptic neuron, so the one that's been sent the message. So it's the dendrites of that postsynaptic neuron, and then it turns back into an electrical signal and decides whether or not to pass on the signal, which is excitatory, or to stop the signal, which is inhibitory. But you don't need to know loads of this information. Like, I don't think there's ever really been a question about this specifically. There's just been questions about what a neurotransmitter is or what a neuron is or something like that. Stages of development. So this is the one where we mentioned the prenatal one before. You might be asked to describe childhood, or you might be asked to pick one. So in childhood, we've got around 4 months neurons in the visual cortex of doubles, so then that allows you to see in colour and 3D. So you don't you see in black and white and 2D when you're first born. And then around 3 years, you've got 1,000 trillion synapses, so lots of them, and then they're selectively pruned afterwards. So if they're not used, they kind of lose that ability, which is why it's really important when you've got a child to stimulate them as much as possible. And then the brain structure starts to develop, so the kind of different lobes of the brain. During adolescence, we've got a lot of remodeling that goes on in the brain, and because the prefrontal cortex is not developed properly, because that only happens when you're 25, a lot of decision making is made from the limbic system, which is emotion, which is why in adolescence you might make decisions that you've not really thought through very well. So actually, if you get adolescence, you can also talk about the prefrontal cortex in that bit not being developed yet. Whereas in adulthood, the prefrontal cortex is fully developed around the age of 25. You can make really good decisions and judgments then, and the risk taking is less, whereas for adolescents, risk taking is higher. And memory peaks around 22 years, but then declines after that. And the cells in your hippocampus start to deplete, which is quite interesting for the memory topic, because we learned about Clive Ware and his hippocampus being damaged. He was 38, so his memory would have been declining anyway. So it makes that study kind of less representative of everybody. And then some brain structures that you need to know. So We have a central nervous system. Our brain and spinal cord is a central nervous system, which you might remember from the criminal topic, where did Isaac? And the neurons are what pass the signals, as we mentioned before. And the different lobes of the brain are the frontal lobe, so the one that makes all the decisions. It's also home of the dopamine system, which links to the schizophrenia and the psychological problems topic. Also, short-term memory functions are in there, and actually long-term memory's in there as well. Parietal lobe is for sensory information. Temporal lobe is for hearing, auditory cortex, which is why visual hallucinations happen in there in the psychological problems topic. Occipital lobe is for vision, so visual information, and actually one that's not been mentioned is the cerebellum at the bottom here, which we learned about in the memory topic. And we also need to know about IQ. So there's a lot of key concepts in development. So intelligence quotient is what IQ stands for, and the tests for IQ are very standardized. They're usually like question and answers. So you either pick from 4 suggestions or you might write the answer. And after the IQ test, you generally get a score. And so the average score is 100. If you score below that, you're below IQ, above that, above IQ. And there's various different ones. So the first one was this Simone Binet test, which was actually developed in France as a way to try and find out which children needed extra support. And then in 1944, they developed the Wechsler Adult Intelligence Scale. So it's the same Wechsler as the Wechsler memory scale from the memory topic in the applications. But this one is about testing intelligence. And this is a picture of all the different ways that they test intelligence. And it tests lots of different things like fluid intelligence, which is problem solving, crystallized intelligence, which is like your knowledge of things that you've learned when you've been at school or learned through life. And things like your verbal skills, your digit span, like things like that are all on there as well. However, we have got a theory by Gardner that suggests that actually we could have multiple intelligences. So a lot of the IQ tests do not test for multiple intelligences. So things like being very good bodily kinesthetics, like an athlete, an IQ test where it's written doesn't really test for that. Same for musical ability, again, not really tested on an IQ test. So you might be very intelligent in some ways, but not others. And so an IQ test will give you a lower score, but actually you might be quite intelligent in certain areas. So they can be quite limited. So we can say, they don't test for all aspects of intelligence. There's also a lot of cultural bias. A lot of the tests that we take in the West, people in other places might not necessarily understand how to answer those questions. So they'll come out with a lower IQ score, but actually they might be intelligent in other areas. If you're not literate, you can't read or write, then you can't really access these. You'll get a lower score, but actually that won't tell you anything about your intelligence. So there's some problems with intelligence tests. The first theory of development is Piaget's theory of cognitive development. So this is the idea of how do we develop cognitively in our minds to understand things, and kind of linked to, intelligence is a measure of cognitive development. So Piaget suggests we've got 4 stages that we go through in different ages. So the first stage is sensory motor. In this stage, you're learning things through touch and all your senses. And in this stage, the skill that you're supposed to develop is object permanence. So the understanding that when something disappears, that it still exists. So if I removed something from what you could see, like a ball, you would know that the ball exists because you are older than 1 year old, whereas a 1-year-old would think that it would disappear. And around the age of 2 to 7, you're in the pre-operational stage. So in this stage, children give like teddy bears feelings. So they give inanimate objects feelings. Don't hurt Teddy, don't hit Teddy, don't put Teddy in the washing machine, because that's really upsetting for Teddy. You also, around the age of 7, decenter. So in the pre-operational stage, you're egocentric. You don't understand something from someone else's perspective. You think everyone thinks like you and sees everything like you see it. But when you get to about the age of 7, you decenter, so you can understand things from other people's perspectives. You know that someone doesn't necessarily feel what you're feeling. You can kind of tell that someone, might be feeling something different. Um, And also in the pre-operational stage, you don't understand reversibility. So you don't understand like how ice goes to water, evaporates, you know, and then goes, back and forth between those. You don't understand that. You don't understand how to reverse things. Whereas around the age of 7, you do. And then also at 7, so in concrete operational stage, and these two are probably the most important because the study that we look at, which is also Piaget, is looking at these two stages, um, is the ability to conserve. So this is the idea that although an object changes, it's still got the same quantity. So for example, if you've got two glasses and one's tall and one's short but wider, and they've got the same quantity in, you would understand that because you have the ability to conserve. But a child under the age of 7 would think that the taller one had more in, which is why you might have had arguments when you were younger if you've got siblings, because you always wanted the taller glass because you thought it had more pop in it. Similarly with rows of counters, if they are spread out more and ones are not spread out as much, then the one that's spread out more you think has got more. And if you are younger than 7, because you can't conserve yet, whereas if you can conserve, you understand just because it's looking longer, we've still got the same amount of counters because you can count them. Then finally, formal operational stage 11 plus. This is hypothetical and abstract thinking. So understanding concepts that are not physical and not concrete. So, for example, you understand what the wind is, what love is, you understand politics, things that are not physical things that, psychology. You understand like what it might be like to go to the moon or Mars or whatever, which if you're not 11, you're going to really struggle to understand those concepts. What Piaget also said about these stages is that they are universal. Everybody goes through them around the world, and they are invariant. So invariant means they go in this order. They don't like you don't go back and forth. You just go one to the other to the other, and there's no kind of like going back or jumping or anything like that. They're in that specific order for everybody. And I've kind of already mentioned all these concepts. These are kind of the key concepts that you need to know that they would ask you questions about. Um, and how they tested egocentrism was with these 3 mountains. So they asked the child, what could the doll see? What could they see? So if you're egocentric, you'll say that the doll sees what you see. If you're not egocentric and you've decentered, you'll be able to say what the doll sees and what you see because they'd be different. And this is the example of the conservation. So we've got the 2 glasses, we've got the counters, we've also got Play-Doh that was used, and in a similar thing, the ability to understand that they've got the same quantity even though they look different. Reversibility also counts with operations in maths. So 2 + 3 = 5 is the same as 5 - 3 = 2. So the ability to kind of reverse those, do algebra, things like that. And then obviously abstract thinking. One of the questions that Piaget asked was, if you had a third eye, where would you put it? So children in the concrete operational stage would only say their head, so they'd say like different places on their face. Whereas if you were in the hypothetical thinking form operational stage, you might say, I'd have an eye on a random tree somewhere, because that would be thinking more hypothetically, or at any other place where you might put it on the roof or whatever. No, Piaget also has a lot of other kind of terminology to remember. So there's lots of terminology in this one, lots of concepts. So Piaget also talks about schemas. So this is similar to the schemas in the memory topic. So they are a mental representation of information. They're like a framework. They're like a little shortcut about information. So let's see, is there a picture? Yeah, so for example, the schema for chair, you might have lots of examples in your schema of what chairs are like. Um, and Piaget suggests that we're in equilibrium when we understand everything. And then when we encounter something that we don't understand, we go into disequilibrium. So we don't really fit right. We don't really understand what this thing is that we've seen. And Piaget says we're like little scientists. So we're kind of like exploring the environment. And so what we do is we either assimilate what we've discovered into our currently existing schemas. So say we've seen a new type of chair, we'd put that into our schema of chairs. But then if we've discovered something that was an object that was like a table, we'd create a new schema for that because it wouldn't go into our chair schema, because obviously it's not a chair. And then operations, these are more complex mental processes that allow us to combine schemas. So we might have something that puts it together, like I'm trying to think of some examples, like furniture might put together quite a few different schemas about chairs and tables and whatever, for example. So some evaluation of this theory, it has been backed up by the research. So the Three Mountains that you saw, that was actually a study by Piaget. So he's got evidence for this. And obviously you did his study, which we'll talk through next, about conservation. So all that is support that these stages exist. Children go through these. They have all these concepts that they learn and cognitively develop in this way. However, some weaknesses, not all of the stages are universal because some adults don't reach that final stage. They don't have the ability to do hypothetical reasoning or they struggle with it. So, for example, when they're doing maths, they still count on their fingers, which is a concrete operational way of doing it. So maybe it's not very valid that they're universal. Also, quite reductionist because it's suggesting that the only reason why we can do these things is because of our age, but actually, it might be because of things like teachers and parents who might help us develop a little bit quicker. And so therefore it kind of neglects the influence of those. So we could have that as a disadvantage. And then we've got Piaget's study that supports it. So this study is trying to see whether or not you can conserve in either the pre-operational or the concrete operational stage. We've got a small group of children from Switzerland. It doesn't specify how many, so you can just say small group. And they're either in one of those two stages. And we've got what's called a quasi-experiment because the naturally occurring IV is the age that they are, which stage they're in. And then it's cross-sectional because we are using different children at different ages. If it was the same children, then we'd be doing a longitudinal, we'd follow them over time. So cross-sectional is like the opposite of longitudinal. And we've got an independent measure design because we've got different children in the age groups. And they've only taken part in one of those groups. And then it's the counters. So we've got counters like this. So we show them these two counter rows and we say, and there's about 5 counters, and we say, is there more in this one at the top? Is there more in the bottom one? Or have they got the same? And then we show them that we space one of them out. So one of the rows out, and then we ask the same questions. Is there more in the top one? Is there more in the bottom one? Or have they got the same amount of counters? And what they found was that children in the pre-operational stage, so below 7, they thought that the row that was longer had more counters in it, so they couldn't conserve because they didn't realise there was the same amount. Whereas the children in the concrete operational stage, they could conserve. They were able to understand that just because it looked longer, it was still the same amount of counters. So this supports Piaget that we conserve in the concrete operational stage and that that's an ability that develops with time as you age and is part of that cognitive development. Now we can evaluate Piaget's study in many different ways. So we've got the results supporting the theory. We've got no gender bias because we've got both girls and boys, so a representative sample. However, we've got an unrepresentative sample because they're all from Switzerland, so it could be quite culturally biased. Maybe we can't generalize and say that everybody can conserve. Maybe there's something different about Switzerland, like the education system or something like that. And then we can use these two studies to evaluate the Piaget study as well. So you can argue that children might have been confused by asking the question twice. So when we said, is there more in this row? Is there more in this row? Are they both the same? That's quite confusing. And then to show the kind of transformation happening where they spread out the counters and then ask them again, they might have thought, am I supposed to be saying this? So they might have shown those demand characteristics. Now, what Rose and Blank did was they only asked the question after without showing them the transformation. So they didn't even show them like doing the transformation. It was already like that with the two counters, and they just said which one's got more, this one or this one, or they both got the same. So maybe that meant that they weren't as confused. And Rose and Blank found that actually more of them could conserve because they weren't confused by being asked that question. So it does support the idea that children show demand characteristic in Piaget's study. Also, it's quite artificial, the experiment, because obviously it's done in a controlled setting. And when you're spreading the counters out, it's like, you watch and you're thinking, the child's probably thinking, why are you spreading those out? And so they might not get ecologically valid results. It might not be like they can conserve in the real world. So what McGarrigle and Donaldson did was they got a teddy bear and went, oh, naughty Teddy has moved the counters. And then when they did that, and that was more a kind of normal task, so it's more natural, rather than watching them spread it out, they were more likely to be able to conserve. So again, if this study was more natural and wasn't as confusing by asking the question a number of times, then maybe more children could conserve. And what that means is Piaget underestimated the age that children could conserve. And so maybe his stages are actually not quite right in terms of the ages. Maybe children can do it a lot earlier than what he suggested. Now, the contrasting theory is more of a nurture. So Piaget's nature, this one's nurture, is Dweck, which is one of them, and Willington, which is the other one. And this is the idea that we cognitively develop through learning rather than just naturally being able to do it. So we've got Dweck's theory of growth mindsets. This is the belief that you can change and develop intelligence over time, as opposed to a fixed mindset that believes that you can't change it. And even if you put loads of effort in, you can't do it. Whereas growth mindset believes that with effort, you can actually change and get better and develop and be able to cognitively improve. So with a growth mindset, people with that mindset are constantly pushing themselves. They take risks. They like a challenge. They're not scared to fail because they want to improve. And they recognize that talent does exist, but unless you're dedicated and you revise and you do lots of stuff, you're probably not going to be able to reach your potential. So the idea is that if you're praised for your effort, you will develop a growth mindset. Whereas with a fixed mindset, because you think that it's fixed, and you think it's important to look intelligent, you'll avoid taking risks. You don't want to look stupid. You don't want to damage your self-esteem. You don't want to feel like you don't understand something, so you won't try and get better. And you miss out on a lot of valuable learning opportunities. So you try to pick easy tasks, like say you're doing some exam practice, you'd do all the multiple choice and you'd ignore the 13 markers. Whereas if you had a growth mindset, you probably would do those 13 markers. And with a fixed mindset, you believe that there's no point in trying an effort because you're either intelligent or you're not. You're good at maths or you're not. And the reason why these fixed mindsets develop is because people have been praised for intelligence. So they've been told, "Oh, you're really clever. You're doing really well because you're so clever," rather than, "Oh, actually, you put a lot of effort in there." So if children are praised for effort rather than intelligence, it will develop this growth mindset. And then Willingham was very critical of believing that we had learning styles, because in education, people believed that if you had information presented to you in a particular learning style, you would learn better. So if it was visual, auditory, which is sound, kinesthetic, which is like doing something. And what Willingham found is that when he did research, like studies on this, it's a myth. They do not help you learn any better. And that while people might have a preference for learning styles, it doesn't actually make you learn any better. It doesn't help your cognitive development, so they don't work. And what Willingham actually found is that if you want to help cognitive development and learn more, you've got to make it meaningful. And this is kind of like in the memory topic, what we call elaborative rehearsal. So making it make meaning. And this is why we come up with like acronyms and things to help us remember things. Like never eat shredded wheat for the compass and things like that. So some strengths of these theories is that they've got many practical applications. We can use these in education. We can make our information meaningful to help us remember it. We can praise people for effort so that they'll develop a growth mindset. And it's also been backed up by the study that we're going to move on to, which is Blackwell. Found it very effective for helping achievement in maths if you've got a growth mindset. So a lot of these are main, like this one's more for Dweck, this one's for both of them. And then we've got, it's quite unethical for Dweck because it does place the blame on children and teachers for their own mindset, rather than it being something like age, which is not anybody's fault, which is what Piaget says. So we could say it's unethical for that reason. And also it's very reductionist. It's just focusing on the nurture explanation and not really considering any nature things. Like, for example, there might be your nervous system might have an impact on how you learn. So that's like linking back to Eysenck's theory about the RAS, so the reticular activating system, which mediates our consciousness. So if that's underactive or overactive, that might have an impact on whether we pay attention and learn, whether we get bored or not. For example, if you're an extrovert, you get very bored. Or maybe like something like our nutrition, which affects the myelin sheath around our neurons, which helps us remember things better. And there could be lots of other explanations, or even just age in Piaget. So it could be considered to be quite reductionist for that reason. Now, the research that supports it is Blackwell, and obviously Dweck took part in this as well. And we've got two studies. So the first one was to see if a fixed or growth mindset had an impact on maths achievements. We've got 373 seventh graders in New York, and they're varied in terms of ethnicity and socioeconomic status, so how rich or poor they are. And we've got a longitudinal correlation. So longitudinal means they've done it over a period of time because they looked at it in seventh and I think eighth grade as well. Yeah, eighth grade as well. And they are taking two measurements. So they're measuring their mindset and they're measuring the maths achievement and see if there's a relationship. So we've got informed consents, quite ethical, and they're completing the motivational questionnaire on a 6-point Likert scale. So a Likert scale being strongly agree, agree, neutral, disagree, strongly disagree. Although that says 6 points, so it might have been slightly different because a Likert scale is usually 5 point. And then they've got their math scores from school. And what they found was that at the beginning, there wasn't really a correlation, but when they tested them later on, there was a correlation. And what it showed was that if you had a growth mindset, you were better at maths. And if you had a fixed mindset, you were worse at maths. But the issue at this stage was that we're using a correlation and you can't establish causality with a correlation. We know that those two things are related, but there could be loads of other third variables that could be explaining the maths achievement. For example, like, do they study or not? Rather than the mindset. So that is why they conducted the second experiment, which is if they teach them about growth mindset, would that improve their maths achievement? So this time they had 99 students. And they again are in New York, varied in ethnicity and economic status. But this time we've got a field experiment and we've got an independent measures design. So they either get a workshop on growth mindset. So trying to develop a growth mindset, teaching children what growth mindset means, seeing whether they've got a fixed or a growth mindset. And then they did a control workshop for the other half of them, which was just a random one on study skills to get them better at studying and revising. And again, they did the same thing as the first experiment. They've got that questionnaire to find out what their mindset is before and after they've done the workshop to see if there's been an increase or not. And they've also asked the teachers to comment on the change of motivation in the students in the class. And then obviously they've got the math scores at the start and at the end. It's a much better study too, because it shows that difference and we can establish causality. So the ones that had the growth mindset were significantly a greater growth mindset after the workshop compared to the control. So we've got 27% compared to 9. So there's a 27% increase in growth mindset compared to 9%. Or in fact, sorry, this bit is increased positivity in lesson. So the maths teachers were finding that when they'd had the workshop on growth mindset, 27% increase in positivity in the lesson, in motivation in the lesson, compared to only 9% from the ones that had the kind of study skills. So clearly growth mindset had an impact on how they did in the lesson. And then they also had a look at the math scores and they found that the math scores were also higher. So again, showing really clearly that it increases motivation and it increases maths achievement and that the workshop increased the growth mindset. So showing that there is support for Dweck's theory that your mindset increases your cognitive development. So kind of supports that. And we can say this study's got lots of ecological validity. It was their real maths lessons that they were in, so very real behaviour that's been tested. There isn't any gender bias, so it's representative. We've got lots of children in there of all genders. And then it's very ethical because we've got informed consent, there's a right to withdraw, and I feel like in the second experiment, they also, the ones that didn't have the growth mindset, I think they did teach them afterwards, because usually that's what you do to make sure that um, there isn't any issues, but it doesn't specify that, so you don't need to mention that. But we've got a lot of criticism. So we've got age bias, it's only 7th and 8th grade. There's culture bias, it's in New York. So both of those things make it unrepresentative. Can't really say that growth mindsets would have the impact, the same impact, the same improvement on cognitive development, everywhere and for all ages. Maybe it only works with younger people, for example. Also, it's only on maths. What about other subjects? It might be that this is really good for maths, but maybe it doesn't work for like science or psychology or whatever. Although I don't think that's the case. I think it probably does work. We can use it as a criticism. It's also unethical because they've been deceived. They've not been actually told properly like what the true aim of the experiment 2 was. And also in the experimental design, because it's an independent measures design, you're being compared against someone who might not be of the same level of maths ability. So they've not like had a match pairs one, for example. So that could be a bit of an issue, particularly if we ended up like all the really good people at maths ended up in the growth mindset group and all the people that weren't as good at maths ended up in the other group. Then naturally you would find those results. That could be a bit of a criticism. It might have been better to do a repeated measures one, like teach them all the study skills first, see what the impact is, then teach them growth mindset, see what the impact is. That probably would have been a bit better than what they currently did. And then finally, application to real life. So this one is about how can it be used in education. So for Piaget, because Piaget is saying that we cognitively develop at a certain age and we can do certain things at a certain age, this is called readiness. So you only teach things that children are ready for. So for example, the national curriculum in the UK, so for example, Key Stage 2, which is before you get to high school, um, they only teach things that are within the age that they're at, so like the concrete operational stage. So they wouldn't teach any kind of concepts like algebra or politics or whatever, because children are probably not going to understand them. Sex education might be quite difficult to understand as well, so they might teach it in a biology way where there's concrete examples. And they're only going to teach like conservation, for example, when they're ready. So when they get to age 7. Otherwise, they're just not going to get it, so there's no point. Also, Piaget suggests active learning. He says that children are little scientists, so they should learn through exploration. So there's a thing called discovery learning where children learn through play, which is what you tend to find in younger years, like reception and things like that. So they learn better that way. And then we've got the learning theory. So for Dweck, we can teach children about mindset, which is what the Blackwell study did, and we can praise them for effort so that they develop that growth mindset. And then for Willingham, we can teach them things to help encode meaning. So we could give them acronyms, we could give them rhymes or songs to try and remember things, raps, things like that. Oh, my thing's just gone off. Oh, there we go. And when we're in school currently, why this, why now, it helps us to kind of understand and put everything in a kind of concept, which helps with meaning as well. So there's lots of different things that we could say about the application to education. And I've made a Blookit for you to have a go at, so the link is there. And obviously all the exam questions and mark schemes are on Teams that you can have a go at. So any questions about any of this, let me know. Oh, I can't find where my Teams thing is. Oh, there we go.